Hi everybody, I am Angela Page, and this is week 3 of Love Your Rebellion's Poetry for the People. So, if you don't know this already, Love Your Rebellion is running a 5-week poetry course via Zoom. It takes place on Thursday evenings at 8 p.m., and we have gone through 3 weeks now of the course. We are now on week 4, and we'll be holding the week 4 class this Thursday. That would be the 30th, April 30th at 8 p.m. via Zoom. You can find the information for that on loveyourrebellion.org or on our Instagram at loveyourrebellion, as well as on Facebook. There is an event, and in that event, we will have the Zoom link so that you guys can participate weekly. But if you can't make it to the weekly classes, we totally understand that. And instead, I am recording each of the week's instructional and exercise portions so that you can enjoy them at your leisure and maybe do a little bit of writing each week and hone your writing skills. So in week 1, we covered imagery, and you can find that video up on our Facebook. In week 2, we covered simile and metaphor. You can find that video up on our Facebook. And in week 3, we are covering juxtaposition. So if I were to recap a little bit on what we've already covered, imagery is about creating vivid images in poetry or in any type of writing. But of course, we're focusing on poetry because we are doing a workshop completely around the concepts that help us become better poets. So when we talk about imagery, we mean that we want the reader to get a really vivid image in their head of what you are trying to portray to them. So concrete details help a lot in this circumstance. And then in week 2, we discuss simile and metaphor. And when it comes to simile and metaphor, really what you're trying to do here is come up with something unique. So simile and metaphor is not a foreign concept for most people. You probably learned about it in like grade school or something like that. But truthfully, it's a lot more than just making a comparison. While that's the foundational concept, it's also about finding unique ways to describe things, to create metaphors, so that you can give the reader a sense of your unique perspective. So we really focused on that in weeks 1 and 2. If you'd like to go back and watch those videos, I really encourage you to do so because it will help you with the concept that we are talking about today, which is juxtaposition. These devices sort of all compound on each other. So when you talk about that, what you really mean is that if you want to get good at one, you probably also have to work with the others. So that's why I started with imagery. It's kind of the foundation of all poetry, being able to describe something in a way that allows the reader to see it, feel it, hear it, smell it, touch it, taste it, right? And then in week 2 with simile and metaphor, we're trying to figure out ways to take those comparisons to the next level, to take those descriptions rather to the next level by including some kind of comparison. So using something in our material world and then comparing it to maybe something else, or finding comparisons for feelings, something that's very vague, like, you know, love or sadness or whatever, and finding ways to make those unique. So with juxtaposition, what we do is we take what we've learned about creating imagery and about comparisons, and now we think about contrast. So juxtaposition is all about the idea of contrasting two things that maybe don't seem to be related to one another, but you can build a relationship between them through your other words. So in this week's class, we're going to take a look at how you can use contrast or juxtaposition to create some really interesting themes and communicate some very inspiring or different perspectives for your work. So again, forgive me if you see me looking up to the right. I am looking at my slides for my PowerPoint, and I will be doing some screen sharing so that you guys can see the poems that we're working with this week and also do the activities, okay? So why don't we get started? All right, okay. So in this week's class, like I said, we're going to review the concept of juxtaposition, which I gave you a little overview of. We're going to look at some example poems as well. We have 2 poems to look at this week, and they both use juxtaposition in different ways. And we're going to do an exercise called Opposites Attract. And we also usually have a weekly workshop, which I do not include in these instructional videos. But if you'd like to participate in the workshop, make sure that you attend this Thursday on the 30th, and you will have the possibility of getting your work workshopped. So we'll skip that, but we will be talking about our weekly prompt. So at the end, I'll give you a little prompt that you can work with for the rest of the week to try to help you hone your writing skills and your juxtaposition skills, okay? All right, so juxtaposition, how is it used in poetry? So you might have learned about this concept in other ways. You can juxtapose lots of different things. It doesn't just have to be words. Images can be juxtaposed, and also you can use this concept in fiction or other types of writing. So you might have seen this being used in maybe fiction, for example. So you may be able to see a juxtaposition of maybe two different character traits that a character has, or qualities that a character has. Or you might see juxtaposition in the differences between two different characters in the book, or juxtaposition between character and setting. So basically it's just a contrast. It's usually two things that are dissimilar that are then connected through the writer building a connection between them. So in poetry, we do it the same way as you would do it in fiction. It's just obviously to a different end. So, you know, in poetry, you're trying to write a poem, and in fiction, you're trying to write like a short story or a novel or something like this. So they're used a little bit differently, but they create the same effect. So the primary purpose for juxtaposition is to create more vivid imagery. So if you use something to, if you use contrasting something to something else, you can kind of embolden both of those things. Both of those things become very big and sort of powerful in the mind of the reader. And two additional things, it can also create tension. So just sort of this anticipation of what's going to happen next, or maybe how these things are connected to each other, and also contributes to the poem's pacing. So the way that the reader takes in the information contributes to the poem's pacing. And oftentimes juxtaposition is part of the theme or the overarching meaning of the poem, and will have an impact on how the poem is read, in addition to the thematic or imagery portions of that. So when we juxtapose, we compare or contrast things to highlight certain characteristics about the subject. So the subject is what we're talking about, right? To make different subjects more alike. So we want to show the similarities. So when you contrast something, you sort of are also comparing them to one another. And by doing that, you're pointing out either how they're dissimilar or how they're the same. So it's kind of an interesting relationship between compare and contrast, or to challenge the typical perspective on a subject. So there may be an assumption about a particular topic, and that can be challenged by juxtaposing it with something that maybe it isn't commonly related to, and could give it a totally new perspective on that subject. So now we're going to take a look at our first poem, and I'm going to go ahead and screen share for you guys. So you should now be able to see this poem here, The Waking by Theodore Roethke. I am now up in your upper corner of your screen, so in case you need to find me somehow. We are going to read this poem together. I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the juxtaposition that is found therein, okay? So follow along with me, please. The Waking. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I feel my fate in what I cannot fear. I learn by going where I have to go. We think by feeling. What is there to know? I hear my being dance from ear to ear. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. Of those so close behind me, which are you? God bless the ground. I shall walk softly there and learn by going where I have to go. Light takes the tree, but who can tell us how? The lowly worm climbs up a winding stair. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. Great nature has another thing to do to make you and me. So take the lively air and, lovely, learn by going where to go. This shaking keeps me steady. I should know. What falls away is always and is near. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. Okay, so first I just want to talk a little bit about Rothke and the background, I guess, of him as a poet. Rothke is a modernist, so that's prior to World War II poetry when we talk about his place in the timeline of poetry. So he is a contemporary of people like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and you can kind of find that in the way that this poem is structured or written, and like, you know, capitalization of ground and great nature and tree. This is something that we don't see in postmodern works. So anything created after World War II, we sort of lose the capitalization of regular nouns, so not proper nouns, for example. You see this as a carryover from older English styles of writing. And so this is an older piece, right? And it kind of has that sing-songy vibe to it too that we really don't see in most postmodern works either. However, it is still a very good example of juxtaposition. So before we get into that part of it, I would like for you to just take a minute and see if you can find places where you see two contrasting concepts being placed next to each other. So just take like a minute or so, pause the video, take a minute or so, maybe reread the piece, and see if you can identify a couple of places where you see something being compared to something else, and see if it kind of gives you an idea of what he's juxtaposing in this piece. So go ahead and do that for a couple of minutes. Okay, so now that you have reread the piece and you try to identify a couple of them, I want to go through some that I notice when I read this particular piece. So if we look at the very first line, I wake to sleep and take my waking slow, we can see a juxtaposition right there. This poem is rather famous, probably one of Rothke's most famous pieces. And in this first line, this is the most famous line of the piece, I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. And it's sort of almost a mantra for some people. And there's a juxtaposition right in it, just flat, in the first four words, this I wake to sleep. Who does that? When we think about waking up, we don't think about going right back to bed, right? These two things are two different things. We process them as being completely separate from one another. One is the life we live daily, and the other is some subconscious manifestation of whatever we believe it is, right? When we sleep or dream or whatever that is. So these two things are not the same concepts, and we don't really see them in relationship to each other very often, other than to say that that they're chronological. One happens after or before the other, right? You wake up after sleeping, you go to sleep while you're awake. So they have a relationship to each other, but we don't see them as that. We see them more like being two different things. So he's contrasting this. And this is a very interesting concept too. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. We would also think about waking up. Waking up is usually not something that's done slowly. Most people in the modern world have an alarm, something that wakes them up. And it's usually a very fast process. Jolting out of bed, getting ready. So we don't really associate slowness with waking up. Another juxtaposition. If we go into the second stanza, he does it again in the very first line. We think by feeling. This is probably in my opinion, one of the most blatant juxtapositions in the entire work. Well, that's because in the Western world, we often see those two things as completely separate from each other. That thinking and feeling are different. We say you think with your head, you feel with your heart, right? So we kind of separate those two things from each other, and maybe even put them apart from one another, like they're you know, two separate sides of the same coin. But Rothke here is suggesting that they are one and the same, that the thoughts that you have occur by feeling. So, and what's really interesting about the juxtaposition is that it only takes him one word to create the relationship, and that word is by. We think by feeling. So in other words, whatever thoughts are created inside of us are created based on the feelings that we have. So he's building a relationship to these two things that are often seen as opposites. So that, I think, is a really good one, a really great juxtaposition. Let's see if we can find some others here. I think that for me, the other one I would want to point out is in the last stanza, in the very first line, this shaking keeps me steady. So once again, we have two things that are separate from each other. We wouldn't think about steadiness and shaking as being one and the same, or something that could complement the other, if that makes sense. So, you know, when we think of being steady, we wouldn't think of someone or something that shakes, right? But in this piece, he creates a relationship between these two things by contrasting them. This shaking keeps me steady, and saying, in a sense, that they have a relationship to each other, that uncertainty is maybe his steadiness, which again is a very unique and different concept to give the reader. While this piece doesn't have a lot of concrete imagery in it, it has a few pieces of concrete imagery, like the lowly worm climbs up a winding stair. I shall walk softly there, but even still, that's a bit vague. I hear my being dance from ear to ear. And I think that might be thoughts, right? Because that's in that second stanza. We think by feeling, what is there to know? I hear my being dance from ear to ear. So it's really hard to kind of determine what he's really, or the speaker is really getting at here. But in the very least, he gives us a lot to think about. You know, the idea of waking to sleep, the idea of thinking by feeling, the idea of shaking, keeping one steady. These are all juxtapositions that create a really interesting dichotomy between the things that he is contrasting. If I had to take a stab at what I think this piece might be about, I kind of think that it is about action versus thinking about doing something. So he keeps repeating these lines. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. And to me, the learn by going where I have to go is really kind of the key to the whole thing. You know, and also the line, we think by feeling, what is there to know? So in other words, experience is the thing that really gives us our understanding of ourselves in the world, not maybe reading about it or watching movies about it or something like this. The only true understanding we can have is by the experience. That's kind of what I think about this piece. And really, the juxtapositions are what communicate that to me. And I would specifically point to the we think by feeling. Our thoughts become things because of our experiences. So to me, that holds the key to the whole thing. So if you really play it right with the juxtaposition, it can kind of be the meat and potatoes of the entire poem. So the last thing I want to point out about these juxtapositions is how compact they are. So a lot of times we think of juxtaposition as long or expository, where you are contrasting one thing to another in long descriptions or something like this. And while we're going to see something similar to that in the next poem, Rothke does something absolutely different from that. He takes it down to just a few words, you know. We think by feeling is only 4 words, and I think that it is the key to the entire poem. So it must have some significance in terms of the relationship of these two things, thinking and feeling, the two things that really I think is the crux of this entire thing he's describing, as well as this shaking keeps me steady, as well as I wake to sleep. All of these juxtapositions are extremely compact and tightly packed, which I think is probably the most ambitious and unique thing about this piece, is just how well he's able to concisely juxtapose things that are not usually talked about in relation to one another. So let's go to the next one. So we have another piece here, and this one is a little different. It is a more of a postmodern piece, and the reason we can tell that is because of the line breaks. So if we go back for just a second, we look at Rothke's poem, the line breaks are pretty similar to one another. They also have this rhyme scheme that's extremely straight, so a direct rhyme scheme. And then we get to Mark Strand's Sleeping with One Eye Open. So this piece is, like I said, written by somebody post-World War II poetry. And so this is a little bit different in terms of how it reads, but the juxtaposition concept is still there. So let's look at this one and we'll talk about how juxtaposition is used in this poem. Sleeping with one eye open. Unmoved by what the wind does, the windows are not rattled, nor do the various areas of the house make their usual racket, creak at the joints, trusses, and studs. Instead, they are still, and the maples, able at times to raise havoc, evoke not a sound from their branches' clutches. It's my night to be rattled, saddled with spooks. Even the half moon, half man, half dark on the horizon lies on its side, casting a fishy light which alights on my floor, lavishly lording its morbid look over me. Oh, I feel dead, folded away in my blankets for good and forgotten. My room is clammy and cold, moon-handled and weird. The shivers wash over me, shaking my bones, my loose ends loosen, and I lie sleeping with one eye open, hoping that nothing will happen. So first I want to say that this is my own bias. I love this poem. I think it's really interesting, and it has a really nice stream of consciousness flow to it that you can follow. And I really like the sounds in it. So there's a lot of really nice sounds in it. And if you're interested in that, week 4, we'll be talking about assonance and consonance, which is what I'm talking about when I say I like the sound of it. So in this piece, he does a little bit of juxtaposing within the lines, but there's a larger juxtaposition. And if you said the house to the person, you'd be right. So he's comparing, but also contrasting these two things, and also kind of personifying himself as the house. So there's actually quite a bit happening in this poem. So it's a little harder to drag out the juxtaposition from this, but we can see it in this contrasting of the house and the person. So in this particular piece, he starts off by describing the house. So the very first few lines, all the way up until instead, actually no, it's here where the poem sort of changes. It's my night to be rattled. So all of this is all of the description of the house, and then from here down, he sort of takes on the personification of the house while contrasting himself against the space that he's in. So it's really interesting because in this juxtaposition, he becomes the house. He takes these two things that are apart from each other. You know, a person is not a home. You know, a person is it might be a noun. They might both be nouns, but they're definitely different, and we don't see them as one and the same. So this juxtaposition is really just calling out the ways that a person can be similar to a house that creaks and moves and bends in the night. And so in this first part, all the way up to the line, it's my night to be rattled, he's discussing the house and maybe even the surrounding trees, or possibly, no, it's definitely the trees, because he says not a sound from their branches clutches. So it's like his property. He's juxtaposing himself against the place that he lives. And so in this contrast, we then see him sort of like become the space. And even when he says down here, my room is clammy and cold, moon-handled and weird, you can't actually be sure if he's talking about the room or himself, because the concept of my room, that could be him. That could be what he considers to be like maybe his his mind or his heart or his soul or whatever we can ascertain that this, my room, could be a metaphor for. So there's an overall juxtaposition happening, the house and the person, and then the person sort of becoming, personifying the creaky house and the shaky branches and all of this. And then there's these smaller juxtapositions inside the piece. So there's this lavishly lording its morbid look over me. This concept of a lavishly lorded morbid look, those two things are not the same. So a lavish lord, so a fancy boss, I guess you could say, and instead looking morbidly at something, that's very creepy, right? Like this sort of, I picture like a man with a monocle, like staring down on you very creepily. And so this, again, communicates a juxtaposition. It puts two things together that we wouldn't normally see, particularly this lavish and morbid. These descriptors are very different from one another. So you can even use adjectives to create juxtaposition in your poetry. And also the down in the bottom here, to lie sleeping with one eye open, that's also a juxtaposition. We don't have our eyes open when we sleep unless we're major pain. Shout out to anyone who catches that reference. But most of the time people are their eyes are shut, right, when they're sleeping. So this is another juxtaposition and probably represents fear. So with this piece, if I had to try to ascertain what this is about based on what we have going on in the work, to me, this is about anxiety or an impending sense of dread. And there's a couple things that make me think that. There's, first of all, there's the words that he uses to describe it. Like even from the very beginning, rattled and creak and racket, raising havoc, clutches, the word clutches, rattled, saddled, the moon lying on its side, catching a fishy light, the lavishly lording, he just basically, he already said, I feel dead. That's got to be a big clue. And then we get this like really sort of, like I said, stream of consciousness flow to this piece that ends with the shivers wash over me, shaking my bones and my loose ends loosen, and I lie sleeping with one eye open, hoping that nothing will happen. This to me is the key down here. You know, the anxiety takes hold, the fear takes hold, the dread takes hold, and it's really hard to sleep. So when I think of sleeping with one eye open, I probably think of very unrestful sleep, tossing and turning a lot, waking up, bad dreams, this kind of thing, and just that hope that the impending doom will not occur. And the last line, the fact that he repeats this nothing, I think, you know, when we're really at our most rattled and we start talking, a lot of times we repeat ourselves, you know, or to get the urgency out of what we mean to say, we may repeat the same word, like so much. To me, this is that same kind of thing, that nothing will happen. Please don't let anything happen. Get that kind of feeling that you get to the work. So this juxtaposition works really nicely. It turns him into the house, and it contrasts these two things that are not normally associated with one another in terms of, you know, metaphor, for example, or comparison, and really creates an interesting picture. So I hope that gave you a clear idea based on those two pieces of what juxtaposition actually is, and how you might be able to use it in your poetry. You can use it compactly, which we can see in both Strand and Rothke's poems, you know, using only a few words to create a juxtaposition that creates a feeling or something like this, or in a long form, like we see in Strand's Sleeping with One Eye Open. We have this juxtaposition of a person against a house. So now we're going to do our activity. So what we do here is I'm going to read this activity and explain it a little bit, and then you will pause the video and take roughly 10 minutes to try to do the exercise. And I will share, I actually did this exercise with the class, and once you come back to the video, the next thing you're gonna see is me sharing my exercise, what I did with it, to give you an idea of how to maybe amend what you've done or to see if you're on the right track. Okay, so this is called opposites attract. Choose 2 words that are opposites. Try to avoid extremely common opposites like good and evil or hot and cold, and vague opposites like here and there. Those won't serve our purpose. Here's a list of some example opposites: safe, dangerous, ally, enemy, build, destroy, succeed, fail, powerful, weak. You may use one of these if you like. I did. I used one of the 2 that I listed here. Then make a list of all the associations of imagery each word contains and all the personal associations you have with each word. So what your paper is going to look like is you'll have one word on one side, one word on the other. You'll draw a line in between, and then you will create a list of images or associations that you have to each word. They do not have to have relationships to each other, and I advise you to not do that. Just think of whatever comes to mind when you think of that word. I also want to guide you and say this: try your best to come up with images. Like when you think of that word, what do you see in your mind's eye? Associations can be quite fun too, but let's try to focus a little bit more on images than anything else, okay? So why don't you take about 10 minutes now, pause the video, and try to do this exercise, and then when you come back to the video, I will share mine with you, okay? Okay, so we're back. All right. So which ones did you choose? I chose powerful and weak. That was my set that I wanted to work with. And as I said, I created a list for each, and I just thought about what I see in my mind's eye when I think about each of these words and wrote something down. So for the first one, for powerful, I'm just going to talk about each list. So for powerful, the first thing I thought of was a 1,000-year-old redwood. You know, those big ass trees in Northern California and Southern Oregon. I think they're all the way up the coast, if I'm not mistaken, all the way to Washington, but that is powerful to me, a big ass old tree. Another one, a merciful and adored leader. Don't know why, but that's what I view as powerful. Overcoming a lifelong fear. I see that as very powerful. 1.21 gigawatts. That is an association. A lot of these others might be like images, or some of them are associations too, but like the redwood is an image. But 1.21 gigawatts is a association, 100% association. And if you guessed Back to the Future, you would be correct. That is just something that popped into my head when I thought of the word powerful, was Doc Brown going 1.21 gigawatts. So that's where that comes from. And then the last one is getting a yes after 1,000 no's. Doesn't that make you feel so powerful? Finally getting the yes, like you've been looking for a job forever or something. You have so many rejections, and then finally someone says yes. Feels so powerful. So my other list was for weak. Weak, someone who can't admit they're wrong. Your snare. So that's an association that's particular to me and maybe other people in the music industry, because probably one of the worst things you can say, worst insults you can give to a producer is your snare is weak. It's like a meme. That's how well known it is, and it just popped into my head. Self-doubt, it's another one that I had. And then a paper bag. Think about how weak a paper bag can be. Rips easily, gets wet, gets destroyed. And then my last one, saying yes after 1,000 no's. So being the person that gives in after being asked repeatedly and saying no, and finally saying yes to something. So as you can see, some of these have innate relationships to each other and some of them don't. If I had to pick the 2 that I thought had innate relationships, it would be the 1,000-year-old redwood and the paper bag. It's interesting because those two things are different, very different from each other, and communicate very different feelings, but they are the same thing. A paper bag comes from a tree, so or recycled trees, as it were. So it's interesting that they can be very different, right? But there's a relationship between them. Like the idea of a 1,000-year-old tree becoming a paper bag, that could be a really nice metaphor for, you know, going from powerful to weak or something like that, you know? And then the other one would be the getting a yes after 1,000 no's and then saying yes after 1,000 no's. And again, this is two different types of people. We could juxtapose those characteristics against each other and really see the difference in how we communicate the idea there of powerful and weak. So juxtaposition can be a great tool to help you communicate vague concepts and feelings and things like that. So that's why we use it, because it really, like I said, helps in creating that vivid imagery, like we saw in Mark Strand's poem, for example. So this is where we would normally have the workshop. And once again, if you would like to participate in the workshops, you have to attend the weekly meetings on Thursday at 8 p.m. And we have opportunity for workshop each week, and we'll be doing one again this week on April 30th. If you care to join us, you can find the Zoom link in the Facebook event. So just look for that on the Love Your Rebellion Facebook page. But for us, this is the end of our time together for this video. I'll leave you with the prompt for the week, which helps you to continue working with juxtaposition throughout the week or whenever you like. And it does have to do with the exercise that we just did. So the prompt says, write a poem using one association or image from each of the lists made in the previous exercise. The goal here is to juxtapose two of the images or associations you created in your lists. The images or associations should be contrasting. So again, for me, I would probably, if I was looking at my list, I would probably pick out the redwood and the paper bag. Those are the two things that seem like they have a relationship that I can build between them. I've discovered the relationship between them by making these lists, if that makes sense. And so maybe I would try to work with those two things, trying to come up with a poem that resonates with the ideas of juxtaposing powerful against weak. So I want you to kind of do the same thing. Take one of the images from, or associations from the list on the left, and then one of the associations or images from the list on the right, and try to write a poem that has the juxtaposition of those two things using those images or associations in them, okay? So hopefully that'll keep you busy this week and give you something to focus on, which we could all use right now. So again, if you'd like to attend the weekly class, we will be having one on slant rhyme, which will also cover assonance and consonance, which are two sound-based poetic devices. And that will be Thursday, April 30th at 8 p.m. via Zoom. Again, you can find the links to the Facebook event with the workshop link on our website, loveyourrebellion.org. And you can also find a link to that site on our Instagram at loveyourrebellion. You can find the Facebook event on our Facebook, and you can find the link to the Zoom meeting inside the Facebook event. So please help us with this and come and participate, or watch the videos that come out. I'll be recording the slant rhyme video next week, and you'll be able to watch that before the week 5 class, okay? So thanks again, guys, and I am very happy that you could make it today. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and end my screen share. If I can get back over to my other screen. Where are you, cursor? There you are. And that's it. So bye, everybody. I hope you have a great week. Take care of yourselves.